You've never seen something like this before. Ben Shapiro gets dismantled on his own show, and it's by none other than William Lane Craig. Those of you who know Ben know he's a strict conservative, and an even better destroyer in arguments. So it's actually interesting to see the tables turn for a change, and that in a conversation regarding the truth of Jesus Christ's identity. The fact that we know what Ben really thinks about Jesus Christ makes the moment even more engaging. Before we get into it, please hit subscribe and that notification button for more videos like this.
Okay. So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets. And finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man.
I've found that in conversations like this, it's always a big plus to have someone in the room who's conversant with history. In this case, there are two of them. So the bone of contention isn't whether Jesus existed. Even Earth's mightiest atheists can't dispute the historical material pointing to the fact. It's a question of Jesus' identity. You see, Ben Shapiro is cut from the same cloth of those who believe Jesus is nothing but a clear-cut criminal. And that's what makes William's approach such a masterstroke. By taking a historical angle, he puts Ben in a tight position where he can't assume plausible deniability as easily as he'd want to. Here's what's even more interesting. William basically tells Ben, forget what people say Jesus is, let's talk about what he thought he was. So it wasn't just people on a hype train calling Jesus names because the charisma fit the profile. They basically bought into what he claimed. And history does agree that Jesus did claim to be he who said he was. There, ladies and gentlemen, is how you set a stage. But of course, Ben being Ben would always disagree.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even.
Right.
There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy.
If the Semitic people believe that the Messiah was supposed to be a political figure, it implies two things. First, they're unfamiliar with the prophecies delivered by their own prophets. One of those such prophecies is Isaiah 53:5, which says, "But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole. And with his stripes, we are healed." Isaiah 53 alone is filled with those prophecies. And that's not just the only chapter or book with prophecies regarding the coming of the Messiah. Secondly, it reveals that the Israelites had a rather simplistic and grossly humanistic view of things. God was never about politics. With the Israelites, he always wanted to be involved. They were the ones who craved the politics of other nations in 1 Samuel 8. And even after God greenlit their request, he was still involved. Why else do you think they suffered so much looting and exile by foreign kingdoms? In simpler words, the politics of the Israelites was never political. It always had so much to do with God. Their return from exile also had much to do with God. So ask yourself how it tracks that the same God would promise restoration through a Messiah would have it be strictly political.
Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
No one could have laid out the significance of the resurrection the way William did it here. And even when Ben tried to pull the, this person did that too card, we saw how quickly it crumbled in the face of that overwhelming significance of the resurrection. And that's the scoop of it. If this man was as blasphemous to God as the high priest claim, then this is the last person God would want raised from the dead. I mean, take a look at what's going on. That same message has gone on around the world. The funny thing is that the resurrection isn't the first time God backed Jesus up. He did so at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In Matthew 3:17, the Bible says, "And lo, a voice from heaven saying, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased.'" So, belief is kind of the principal problem here. That and a complete disregard for what is written in the scriptures. Which is why you should like this video and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Let's get back to it.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory.
I can't imagine how difficult it would have been for William if he didn't have these facts. Ben would have torn him apart, and that goes without saying. I also love how the facts kind of build on each other, like they're interwoven, gradually growing in scale until it becomes this full-blown faith that people practice now. I found that third fact most interesting because it helped me paint a relatable picture. Have you ever had a friend or neighbor who became the exact opposite of who they were? Maybe this guy or woman, they were quiet and timid once, and then all of a sudden they're bold and eloquent. I don't know what you'd be thinking, but I know what's going on in my head at that moment. I'm thinking, gosh, what did they see? What happened to them? That right there is the disciples' story. They were quite timid when Jesus was around. Most of them ran and hid when Jesus was arrested, and they were scared to death after his crucifixion. Out of nowhere, they became so bold and courageous and began preaching his message to every corner of the world. That little experience with your friend or neighbor didn't lie to you, and it's definitely not lying now. They saw something, and they said it was the resurrection. Like William said, now it's a case of whether they were all hallucinating, and you'd find sooner or later that backing up that claim isn't as easy or as simple as it sounds. As always, let me know what you guys think in the comments section. If you found this video interesting, you'd be doing someone a favor by sharing it with them. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.